When this run of them are gone, we're not going to offer it ever again. Infowars.com. Okay. Just please remember the broadcast, and we are listener-supported. But that means telling folks to sign up at twitter.com/RealAlexJones. That means sending people to listen to the free audio streams. We now have reached over 600,000 people a day that listen to the free podcast or tune in to the live streams. Over 600,000 now. On AM and FM, over 2 million listeners a day. I'm not bragging. You know, major feature, biggest story in Rolling Stone, all over national television, separate from the Charlie Sheen thing. I just got a call by one of the biggest talk radio publication that all the big elites go to at their annual event, wanting me to be keynote speaker, cover of it. That's because we've been this big secret, and I've been happy to be under the radar, but now we're out, you know, from under the radar. They see us. They know we're coming in over Tokyo, baby, with the A-bomb, and we're going to drop it. Or I should say Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Tokyo had already been bombed into slag. But the point is, this is the info war, and we're not playing games, okay? And you are the engine, the muscle, the brains, the guts, the sweat, the tears that drives it. And as things get worse and worse, more and more people are going to listen to what we're saying because we know what we're talking about. And, you know, I've had so many experts on, like Joel Skousen, who pretty much give the same perspective but with different tweaks, different areas of deeper understanding. And so many of my experts who I really trust and have listened to over the years and learned from have explained, if you watch mainstream analysts, they're wrong about 80% of the time or more. Not because they're stupid either. They're there to mislead. My experts are right about 95% of the time. I'm right about that percentage of the time because the globalists sometimes tweak things because we're following their own blueprint. We know their plan. Now, that said, Trilateral Commission in the 70s publicly planned this global currency battle. They talked about it coming 3 or 4 decades in the future, how they would then have a global Bancor or Phoenix. They had different names. Now they've openly announced that. They're launching QE3. Davos wants 100 trillion additional. They've had the Chinese president, the head of the G20 in France, all badmouth the dollar. Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine this week saying the end of the dollar's nigh, and that it's actually not going to be a bad thing. You know, like having your head cut off is not a bad thing. And now we have the biggest bond fund in the world dumping U.S. treasuries today, saying it's not part of their investments. China announced last week that by the end of this year, they will not accept any currency but yuan to do business in China, buying finished goods or raw material. They're the biggest retail producer in the world, one of the biggest producers of raw material, rare earth minerals, you name it. The total conversion away from the dollar has now been signified. Now, it'll be a basket of things for the future, but then there's going to be a transition. So I want to talk with Joel Skousen about that. I want to get into his view on what's happening in North Africa and the Middle East. Sarkozy giving the green light and calling for airstrikes. The move is on. Blackwater all over the situation. Got mainstream news on that. Saudi Arabia teetering on collapse. Lindsey Williams, Inside Oil Company exec, predicted all of this. I know his name, not Ken Fromm, the dead one, the even more high-powered. 4.5 months ago, laid it all out. We're going to talk to Joel Skousen about it, but then we're going to talk about Endgame with him and how he has the information, and I tend to agree with him, that the globalists are planning to absorb a Chinese or Russian strike down the road as a way to fully reorganize our society, destroy them, and then set up a true dark age technocratic hegemon out of that crisis. But I believe they may even launch the attack themselves while counter-striking the Russians and Chinese if they can't elicit them to do it. But we're going to talk about it all with Joel Skousen. Joel, long introduction, but good to have you back. You are the editor of worldaffairsbrief.com. Kicking off first, can you go through the signpost and what it signifies for the dollar and global coordinated currency devaluation?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Good to be with you, Alex. Before I do, I just want to make one comment on InfoWars because I noticed this. I'm going to cover it in this week's World Affairs Brief. Major attack heading the way of Alex Jones. You have successfully eclipsed all of the attempts to denigrate and make you as if you're nothing out there. You're obviously the most effective force out there on the constitutional right. and the powers that be are taking aim. And you know, the Rolling Stones piece was kind of a not so subtle hit job, full of pejoratives and negative, including even calling your building, you work in a squat building, you know, instead of a low conservative building. But I just, you know, they've taken after Glenn Beck, and a lot of that is because of the strong material that he filched from you, frankly, that gave him the strength that the establishment had to come after him. But
well, by the way, they also did, and I haven't analyzed, and I hate to interrupt you, I mean, I'm known for this, but it just came to mind. I haven't done a full analysis of it yet, but I have read it. And I would tell them, yeah, I smoked marijuana a few times, didn't like it. And then it turns into Alex then quit marijuana when he was a sophomore, like I was a marijuana head. And now that I've reread it, there's all sorts of semantical kind of by the way, this is not a squat building. I mean, these are 11-foot or 10-foot ceilings. It is a one-story brick building. I mean, this, but yeah, I mean, it's filled with stuff like that.
Yeah, and what I'm saying, though, is that this is a sign that you're being very, very effective, Alex, and I just wanted to add my congratulations and support that you're, when you get the notice of these people and they come after you, you're doing something right.
Well, thank you, sir. And again, I'm almost embarrassed to even brag. I'm not saying, wow, look, you know, we're big. It's actually scary to have this level of responsibility. But, you know, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they attack you, then you win. I mean, there's been a lot of behind-the-scenes attacks as well, a lot of government COINTELPRO from the grassroots. As Cass Sunstein said 3 years ago in those memos he wrote for Harvard and the Chicago Business School, both, he said, media that's seen as establishment has no credibility. We've got to pose as anti-establishment and cause infighting within those groups. Can you briefly speak to that before the dollar?
Well, you know, there are some indications, and they hit Dr. Stanley Monteith, for example, just recently with the concept of infighting within the groups. And some of them are using my material in the World Affairs Brief to try to cause a schism, because I did a critical analysis piece of Lindsey Williams, even though I'm supportive of Lindsey. And we're going to talk about the money issue and hyperinflation and how, in fact, the dollar could collapse, or if it could collapse, in what kind of time frame. But my job in the World Affairs Brief is to give more substance and critical analysis, which people really appreciate. But I've been critical of Bob Chapman, for example, in claims of hyperinflation. And Stan and I talked about this, and Bob and I are good friends, but...
well, as long as it's academic, there's nothing wrong with it, with disagreements.
That's right, and it's not that I'm attacking Bob and saying he's a nut and he's a, you know, I've never used it, and neither was Lindsey Williams. I've always said he's very, very sincere, he's on our side, and this is my critical analysis of what this can mean and what does it mean to have the powers that be talking to you, and whether or not they're really trying to help or whether or not they're spreading disinformation. And those are legitimate arguments, academic ones, and sincere among friends. But, of course, the mainstream is starting to make this look as if there is an attack mode, and that simply isn't true. There's none of us that are attacking one another, but simply trying to get to the truth and analyze exactly how this is going to come down as best we can.
Yeah, Rolling Stone did things like call me and say, oh, I noticed Rush Limbaugh talked about some films you're in. What do you think of that? And I said, he's a political prostitute. And then the article turns to them being here in the office and me running around yelling Rush Limbaugh is a whore. I mean, there is little stuff in there like that. But side issue, shifting since you brought up, what is your view on hyperinflation? What is your view? Because, you know, I've seen dollar devaluation coming, it's here, but then when the mainstream media starts saying the dollar's going to die, it almost makes me suspicious that it isn't. What's your view on the biggest bond holder, biggest bond fund, saying they're not going to buy U.S. Treasuries anymore? I mean, what's your take, Joel?
Well, this is a little complex, and let me get through this because
yeah, go ahead.
We just can't wipe over this. This is very, very important to understand. First of all, when we talk about hyperinflation, I'm using the traditional definition of hyperinflation, which is German-type hyperinflation, where it's a cycle built on a cycle and it spirals quickly out of sight into destruction. You cannot have that kind of German inflation, hyperinflation, take place without an actual injection mechanism from the federal government getting money into the hands of into the hands of people every month, an increase. In other words, if you don't have that injection mechanism where people automatically get a rise in salary, you can't have a spiral of increasing prices.
The bankers are keeping the money on top and consolidating all the big pieces of the board. They're not pumping it out to the public. So isn't it more like stagflation?
That's exactly my point. It's stagflation, where inflation is externally happening and driven, and the people can't keep up, and so you have a recession happening as well as rising prices. Now, Bob Chapman is talking about 20% inflation. He's calling that hyperinflation, and that's our only disagreement. I agree that inflation could get to 10 to 20%, and it would be very damaging to the economy.
But that's not hyper.
But that's not hyperinflation. That's what I disagree is hyping the word hyperinflation, because that's talking about, runaway inflation, which cannot happen without this injection mechanism. So what we've got now, Alex, is externally driven inflation, and it's because, as I pointed out, there's two economies working here. One is the speculative economy, which all the big banks are involved in and driving. There's the Forex, there's the futures market, there's the hedge funds, there's the derivative market. That money, only about 20% of that money ever gets back into the real economy. The speculative economy is huge, and we're billions and billions of dollars are churning every day of the month, just making increases in interest off investment, and that's what they're living on in the big banks, and they're making about, as high as 15 to 20% on the money, whereas in the real economy, you're lucky to get 5%, even in high cap rate real estate investments. So the big money isn't going into the real economy. That's why the banks aren't lending, because they want to stay within the speculative market. The problem is all of the inflation of the Fed is going into that speculative market, and that's going out into the international players, whether it's going to Europe and the bailouts that have gone to the European banks, or the bailouts that have gone to various Asian banks, and China, of course, is stuck with a lot of this money. So what's happening is they're starting to bail out of the dollar by buying things with the dollar. They cannot dump dollars on the market while destroying the speculative market. If you dump 10% of Chinese bonds onto the market, the rest of the bonds would collapse in price, and they would lose 90% of their value. So what are they doing? They're spending dollars to get the maximum worth, and that's why copper prices are rising. That's why all of the precious metal prices are rising. That's why cotton is rising. Most of your major commodities that China is stockpiling, as well as other Asian countries and African and even Arab countries now started to stockpile because of the unrest there. That's what's driving prices up, not internal demand inside of our economy. That's going down. So that's the proof that we're dealing with stagflation. Now, let's talk about collapse of the dollar, what it would take to collapse the dollar, and a replacement with world currency. Obviously, we know that's what's going to happen someday. My point is, technically, I don't think they can get there without hyperinflation, which, as I pointed out, is very difficult to do. Let's talk about the numbers. First of all, we've got about $200 trillion that are printed and in circulation around the world. And we have about 500 to 700 trillion, in my estimation, in non-monetized dollars out there. That means they've never been printed. These are just on the books. For example, when companies like AIG make out derivative contracts, they don't even have to have the money in the bank. They can write a $300 million derivative contract and simply say, we promise to pay you $300 trillion. It's never been created. It's not in their bank account. This is an absolute Ponzi scheme. So you have this massive amount of trillions of dollars that are on the books out there, and there's not enough money that's printed to ever fulfill those contracts, and they don't intend to, because they roll these contracts over one time after another, taking little percentage differences. And that's the only thing that gets collected in monetized dollars, is the difference in the rollover when they sell that contract to another